But I think the real significance of the GAA in the US across the 20th century is people landing in America who need to find their way, who need to understand this new country. You're either going to go to the Catholic Church or you're going to go to the GAA. And the GAA is where you're going to find somebody from home who's going to give you somewhere to live. They're going to make the introductions to give you a job. It's where you're going to socialize. It's where people meet their future partners, husband, wives, etc. Because it's so identifiable. It's so familiar to people leaving Ireland. It really does give them that kind of way of, at one level, replicating their Irish life so they can understand their ideas of home, but it also gives them an entree into American society.
Welcome to Ireland and the Making of America,
a podcast exploring how Ireland and the Irish helped shape the United States, politically, culturally, socially, sometimes in ways that we rarely think about.
I'm Liam Kennedy, Director of the Clinton Institute for American Studies at University College Dublin.
And I'm Scott Lucas, journalist, political analyst, and professor of international politics at the Clinton Institute.
In this episode, we're joined by Mike Cronin, who's the Academic Director of Boston College in Ireland and a Professor of History in the Irish Studies program at Boston College. Mike is the author and editor of 20 books, many of these focused on sport, including Sport and Nationalism in Ireland, the GAA, A People's History, and Inventing the Boston Game.
Mike is going to help us explore the Irish sporting experience in America from the mid-19th century through today. Let's play ball.
Hello, Mike. Welcome to the podcast. So, sport at last. I know Scott's been keen to get here. I won't pretend to expertise, but to interest. But I am genuinely interested in what we can learn about thinking at American sport, the Irish presence, the Irish role. It's broad, and if there's one person who can give us a sense of that breadth and the importance and significance of even thinking about sport in terms of Irish America, it's Mike Cronin. So again, Mike, thanks for being here.
No problem at all.
Where are you going to start the story?
I'm actually going to start the story with the very Irish thing of the GAA. Interesting, founded in 1884 in Ireland. The first All-Ireland takes place in 1887. But then they have this great idea, let's invade America. So 1888, the decision is made to send a team of hurlers and athletes under the GAA flag out to America to do this huge tour, and it's going to take in the northeast of the US. It's going to go to Canada. It's going to be amazing. And the main thing for them, the big driver, is they're going to charge people to look at these Irish athletes, and they're going to make loads of money, which doesn't happen. They get it completely wrong. It loses money. It's a disaster. But what's interesting is it's that sense of the GAA reaching out to, by the 1880s, this massive Irish diaspora that's been in the US post-famine. So you look at the figures. They play a hurling match in Boston. And to give you some context, this is early autumn. So, it's starting to get cold. It's not midsummer. But 10,000 people turn up to watch a hurling match on Boston Common. And the papers talk about, this is the crowd of the Celts arriving. These are the poor, impoverished Irish seeing their game. So it's very much this kind of linking with home. That I think is still true with the GAA today, that as much as the Irish in the US have assimilated, there's still that need to reach back home. And the GAA is probably the most obvious example of that. When I go to Madison Square Gardens, again, crowds sort of put at 10 to 12,000 people. But various events are cancelled. The whole Canadian leg's cancelled because of weather. Some of their sort of events are called off because of dispute within American athletics. So financially it failed. But I think the most telling thing at the end of the tour is a team comprised 53 men. When the boat leaves to go back home, there's only 23 on it. That 30 of these men choose to stay permanently in America, to emigrate effectively.
They defected. Are you saying they defected, Mike?
They defected effectively, yeah. But I think it's very telling of where Ireland is at that point, but also the pull of the US as a place to be for the Irish, that these guys have seen these huge communities. And on the sporting level, I think it's quite interesting that you then get to one man who'd gone on a tour, a guy called Jim Mitchell. He actually stays in the US, and in 1904 competes in the Olympics for America and wins a bronze medal. So he's a very successful sort of sporting immigrant, if you like. But it is the idea that what you see there within that invasion story is the relationship of Ireland to its diaspora in the US, but then almost being a member of that diaspora is more appealing than coming back home.
Okay, so how does the game get rooted in the US? I mean, what you've given us is really something quite spectacular, the numbers you've described, etc. But how does it get rooted into the diaspora on a more, shall we say, communal basis? I mean, what kind of cultural work is it doing?
I think what's important is that it's very much like the county associations in the US. If you look at the teams that emerged late 19th into the 20th century, you'll very much see that if you look at the teams in Boston, for example, it will be Boston Kerry or Boston Cork. They're not coming together to play GAA as a sort of we're the Irish. They're very much still rooted in their kind of parochial local from home. But I think the real significance of the GAA in the US across the 20th century is people landing in America who need to find their way, who need to understand this new country. You're either going to go to the Catholic Church or you're going to go to the GAA. And the GAA is where you're going to find somebody from home who's going to give you somewhere to live. They're going to make the introductions to give you a job. It's where you're going to socialize. It's where people meet their future partners, husband, wives, etc. And I think the GAA forms, because it's so identifiable, it's so familiar to people leaving Ireland, it really does give them that kind of way of, at one level, replicating their Irish life so they can understand their ideas of home, but it also gives them an entree into American society, because what they do when they land and they go to the GAA, they're meeting people who've been there for decades, who know how the system works, who know how to play it. So I think that one level cultural reproduction is important, but also the idea is the pathway into America.
Yeah, and what's the scale of this, Mike? I mean, which particular parts of America are picking up it? Are we talking about, leagues? I mean, how many teams? I mean, what's the scale?
We're talking, okay, I mean, most GA clubs are based in cities that have big diasporas. So, New York, Boston, Chicago, San Francisco, etc. As of now, there's 171 clubs across America. Wow. Which are all affiliated with the GAA back in Dublin. And that kind of numbers has been fairly steady across sort of mid-20th century onwards. I think what's a real mark as well is if you look at the All-Ireland Championship, we obviously think there's 32 counties who play football or hurling. It's actually 34 because the GAA honoured the idea that there's two big diaspora communities in the world that are rooted to the GAA, one being London, but the other one since the 60s is New York. So New York competes in the All-Ireland competition. Yep. So again, you've got a very, within Gaelic Park, the big ground in New York, you have, again, the idea of replicating home at the athletic level of playing Gaelic sport, bringing your second generation kids along to learn something Irish, but also the way the club functions in the way it does back in Ireland. It's where you might go and learn Irish. You might send your kid to learn Irish dancing. It's where you go to weddings, funerals, wakes, etc. So it's this kind of idea that the GA club, yes, it's about sport, but it's also a really important social and community hub within the Irish diaspora in the US.
Given we had earlier sessions that are dealing with the more sort of political settlements of the Irish into the United States and the way that, urban politics was taken up and so on, and the movement into the unions and the importance of parishes, does sport play a role in any way that's, more political and less cultural in that regard?
Absolutely. I mean, if you look at certainly around Tammany Hall, the idea that period in the 1860s and 1870s, post-Civil War, when the Irish emerged as that political force, you've also got the two big sports of the period are baseball and boxing. So the New York example would be one of the early teams in New York baseball was called the New York City Mutuals. And they were very much kind of rooted sort of in and around the Irish districts. Tammany Hall and Boss Tweed put $6,000 a year into the baseball team, which effectively allows all the players to become professional in a way we'd understand it. They're not doing another job. They are professional baseball players, which allows the mutuals to be successful. Everybody understands that contract. So the idea is the team does well, you vote for me because I funded them. So it's a very kind of clear sense that there is a link between sporting success and the way politics work. Within boxing, you've got a guy called James Yankee Sullivan, born in Bandon, 1807. He arrives in the US in 1841. He's had a detour. He's been to Australia as a convict, but eventually let go. But he's a prize fighter. He's called Yankee Sullivan because he wears an American flag around his belt. But he's actually, his job is he is a political enforcer for Tammany Hall. That he basically goes and breaks heads if people aren't doing the right thing. And as a prize fighter, he's also very, very good. He's American heavyweight champion in 1851. A title he loses 2 years later to fellow Irishman John Morrissey in a fight that was fought for a prize of $2,000, which is a lot of money in 1851. You asked me about politics. The reason I'm telling this story is at one level you have Sullivan, who's this aggressive enforcer of politics. The man who beats him, John Morrissey, he's rises, if you like. He gets elected to Congress in 1866 and 1868. So that idea you can see there just with the two men. One's a brawler who's going to make you do what you're told, but the other one's out there on the back of his fame as a boxer, getting votes and getting into Congress. So there is that link between kind of the entry point of the Irish into, broadly speaking, city and national politics.
Yeah, it's fascinating stuff. And there's so many of these people you're talking about are, to use the cliche, colorful. I can see why you've been drawn to this in the past and why you would write about it and research it. It really bears a lot of analysis, especially when you get into that political angle on it and so on and so forth. But you've now crossed us very deftly from the GAA into baseball into boxing. So could we talk a bit more about those sports from the 19th century forward and what role the Irish had that gave them quite a significant symbolism in both sports, I think.
Yeah, so I mean, baseball is a game that has been codified, exists before the Civil War. Sports historians argue that it's a game of the Northeast, but during the Civil War, as the two sides are sort of interfacing with each other, observing what they're doing, they're captives, that the South sees baseball for the first time. And in a way, after the war, the dispersal of the troops back home, baseball travels across the country. So baseball kind of roars into life as the game, the first big game in the US from the 1870s. And what's fascinating about it is the Irish take to baseball very, very well. Now, is that because they've all played hurling and they're good with a bat? Who knows? But the thing is, it's a professional sport from very early on. So the attraction for the Irish is you can earn money. So by 1872, the Sporting News claims that a third of all professional baseball players are Irish.
Ooh.
And they say that the Irish are so attractive to what we now understand as owners of teams that many non-Irish players change their names to O'Kelly or whatever it may be so that the owner thinks they're Irish, that the Irish are an attractive thing. And it's so dominant that the period from the 1870s to the 1920s, when it starts breaking down, is called the Emerald Age of baseball. That the Irish are so dominant in this first 50 years of the professional game that's how it's termed by baseball historians. So if you look at the New York Herald analysing a game between Cleveland and New York, it all goes to show that as a nationality, the Irish have a peculiar talent for ball playing and have, since baseball became professional, monopolised the best positions on the diamond and carried away the bulk of the money paid out for salaries. So it really is, this is better than working in a sweatshop. You are a star, you're getting sponsorship deals, you're ghostwriting columns. It's really important. So baseball is absolutely crucial to the Irish sporting experience. But I think it's where you get the counterpoint to the GAA. Baseball isn't about home. Baseball is about becoming American. Baseball is about deep assimilation. You are playing what's then termed the national pastime. So yeah, absolutely critical. Obviously, again, there's cliches there, there's stereotypes. The Irish players are very well known for brawling, for fighting, for drinking, for example. And that's a kind of real, is it a problem? I don't know. But I mean, you look at There's two players, a guy called Mike Kelly, Ed Delahunty, who are very, very famous baseball players in the 1880s, but they both basically, they're sacked by their teams for constant alcoholism. That Mike Kelly's manager, the owner, sorry, sends a policeman to follow him through the nightclubs and bars of New York. And the policeman sort of said, "Oh, Kelly was drinking at 2 a.m. I was drinking lemonade." And Kelly says, "Lemonade? I wouldn't drink lemonade late at night. It has to be whiskey." And there's other sad stories that do fit into that stereotype of drinking. Jack Doyle, who'd emigrated from Kerry, becomes known as Dirty Jack Doyle. Played 17 seasons, amazing player, fights with the opposition players, famously fights with umpires who give him a bad decision. And classically, to really understand this man, he's come back from an injury. He's been out for 6 weeks. His first game back, he has a disagreement with the spectator, jumps into the stands, pummels the guy, and in doing so breaks his wrist, and he's out for another sort of couple of months. So, again, that it's a stereotype, but it's appealing. The crowd loves this. That the numbers attending baseball at this period to watch Irish players are really significant.
Okay, so you're saying that this myth, some would say questionable stereotype, or if they fight in Irish, isn't really all that questionable. It was real.
Yeah, I think also as well. I think again, I think you can, as it were, put this into a sectionalized chronology. That if you look at that early post-Civil War period, the Irish are there as boxers. They're there as baseball players. I think as a process of assimilation continues, what you then see is by the 20s, the number of Irish players playing baseball drops off. They're replaced by other ethnic groups. What they then do is move into management. So you have people like Connie Mack, whose father's from Killarney, his mother's from Belfast. If we think people like Alex Ferguson managed Manchester United for a long time, Connie Mack managed the Philadelphia Athletics from 1901 to 1951. Wow. A whole half century, retiring at the age of 88. And statistically, he's still there by longevity as one of the great managers. First manager to win the World Series 3 times, wins a total of 5 World Series, and still now he's ranked 3rd in history. Same thing, Joe McCarthy, another Irish immigrant, managed the New York Yankees from 1931 to 46. So again, it's that kind of idea that what you're seeing is that social mobility, even within sport. They stop playing and they move upstairs.
Scott, I want to ask you a question on this because, you grew up in the United States and I know you're a sports fan and a baseball fan. Does this kind of Irishness of baseball, does that resonate with you and your memories of the sport?
There's a tension here that I wanted to ask Mike about because he's identified this early period of baseball and not, by the way, just simply in the Northeast, as he quite rightly pointed out. I mean, the first professional baseball team in modern baseball is in Cincinnati. So It's in Ohio. Yep. But then, Mike, what I'm thinking about is when we celebrate, as it were, ethnicity in baseball, I think outside of maybe Black players all around Jackie Robinson breaking the color barrier in 47, and then that general, as it were, recognition of Hispanic players. Cinco de Mayo is always a big baseball day, and then there's individual celebrations. But I didn't grow up with an appreciation of Irish ethnicity in baseball, and this would be going back to like the late 1960s, early 1970s. It just, am I missing something here? In other parts of the country, was there still an Irish connection celebrated with baseball? Or had there just been this assimilation that had sort of flattened this out?
I think it's been assimilation that just flattens it out, that the identification of Irish, that by the time you get into the period leading up to the Second World War, how readily are people who are playing baseball identifying as Irish American? Or are just American at that point? And I think it becomes less obvious. And again, I think that transition from player to coach, you also see that with a guy called Joe Cronin, who plays in the 20s, because it's voted most valuable player in the 1930 season, but then becomes president of the American League. So again, that journey upstairs. You look at Walter O'Malley, whose family emigrate from Mayo, made his money in law in Manhattan, and becomes the owner of the Brooklyn Dodgers. So now we're at the level of ownership. O'Malley's important. You talk about the changing ethnicity of sport. O'Malley is the one who's signed Jackie Robinson that breaks that color bar. So again, I think it's that kind of it's there's a level of assimilation that I'm sure in the long tail, if you did a deep dive, Irish American, Irish heritage players are probably still there. But it's also that transition into management and ownership that's critical as a sign of how successful segments of the Irish population are becoming.
Okay, before we fully get into maybe that question of where does that more assimilated stage leave us, today? What about other sports, Mike? I mean, you referenced American football just in passing, and of course, I'm immediately thinking of ownership, people like Dan Rooney. Does this sort of fit the pattern as well, or is American football different?
American football's different. I think the big difference is that you see when American football is sort of codified, if you like, that process where Walter Camp at Yale becomes the father of modern football, that collegiate football, probably through to the 1930s, is an elite game of, the Ivy League, which are not the colleges where Irish immigrants, children of, are there. So I think you don't see that there are Irish American players definitely in the NFL, but you don't see that sort of deep representation, certainly within media, of the Irish players in the same way you would do with baseball. I did check. There's 9 Irish Americans in the NFL Hall of Fame, so that's not many. So in that sense, they're not really there. I think you're right that it's the ownership thing is far more important. I think there's two or three key figures. So Joseph Carr, immigrant from Armagh, becomes the second ever president of the NFL. He's there from 1921 to 39. He drafts the constitution and the bylaws of the NFL. He develops a franchise system. He creates a championship system. And he's known as the father of professional football. So again, it's that kind of strange thing that there's not many players, but the man who makes professional sport, not collegiate sport in the footballing terms, is Irish. The Rooneys, obviously critical background in Newry. One thing that Joseph Carr, as head of the NFL, has done, the franchise system, he's creating new franchises across the country. So Art Rooney buys the Pittsburgh franchise in 1933. Obviously, then Dan Rooney takes over, later US ambassador to Ireland, founder of the Ireland Funds. And again, he's critical for the Rooney Rule, 2002, which means that any management or senior role within an NFL team has to interview an ethnic minority on their panel of candidates. And obviously, we're now into the third generation with Art Rooney as the head of the Pittsburgh Steelers, who obviously, he brought the Steelers back to Ireland in 2025. That when the NFL teams all had to choose a home foreign base, as it were, the Pittsburgh Steelers chose Dublin. So that kind of, again, modern transatlantic sense of returning home is still there. The New York Giants, owned by the Mara family, again, classic Irish story, founded by Tim Mara, the son of a New York policeman who's a descendant from Tipperary. So again, it's that level of the social rise of the Irish that they can afford to be owners in the NFL. They're not necessarily players.
So a lot of this would speak, I suppose, to the other patterns of assimilation that we've talked about elsewhere, which are more broadly, to do with different sectors of work and so on. We see it happening throughout the 20th century. So you think that the more historical pattern of assimilation fits well into sport here? They move from being, as it were, the primary actors on the field to the people who are in much more successful management ownership positions right across the board.
Yeah, I think that's true. And I think it also speaks to Scott's point that I think the people who rise to those kind of positions are very relaxed with their Irish identity or their Irish heritage. Whereas I think those kind of lower level people who may be showing off as a baseball player deep into the 20th century, in their lifetime, that Irish heritage may have fallen away as a stated part of their life. So I think that kind of assimilation pattern and the economic rise are two important stories about the Irish from where they were in that kind of post-famine, post-Civil War period.
I want to jump in and ask you about a couple of examples, though, and I want to see how they fit in because they're more overt, as it were, branding of the Irish. And the first is not professional football, but university football. So there you've got to go to one of the, and I say this with regret as a University of Alabama fan, but one of the best known university teams is the Notre Dame Fighting Irish. This is from 1887, about the same time that GAA is crossing over, that this starts this. So how do we get this, clearly a Catholic school, I understand that, but how do we get this Irish identification with Notre Dame, especially when their real successful coach that put them on the map is actually Norwegian?
Somebody works at Boston College. Do I really want to talk about this? Yeah. I think, Scott, you're right that I think the self-identification of Notre Dame as the Catholic college is hugely important. They emerge and roar into the world of football. It's said there's various kind of origin myths about this, that there's a game in 1924, 23, something like that, where they're being beaten and at halftime, one of the players says, "Come on, we're Irish, we're going out there and fight." So this idea of the motivation. What is clear is that what the university don't like is that the press regularly refers to Notre Dame in derogatory terms. The football team is either the Papists or the Dirty Irish. So the idea that the Fighting Irish emerges formally in 1927. It's the first time it's kind of used as a sort of their branding. And I think it is to counter those negative stereotypes that, being Catholic isn't necessarily, devious or bad or dirty or malign. It's actually a positive. We're out there fighting. And they obviously go all the way eventually with the whole leprechaun symbol and the whole thing. They very much lean into it. It has, I agree with you that the most famous coach is Norwegian, but actually they have three major Irish-American coaches. Frank Leahy during the 40s, Terry Brennan during the 50s, and Dan Devine during the 70s. And again, I think a bit like the return of the Pittsburgh Steelers. And obviously Notre Dame has come back and played football games in Ireland, I think on 3 occasions now. So again, it's that very much kind of, they are rooted in the past within Ireland. And it's a clear part of their identity.
I then want to shift sports, if I can, to basketball, because although I grew up in the American South, but it's convert or die if you live in Boston, which I did for 18 months. And of course, I guess for many people who don't know American sports that well, they may have heard, however, of the Boston Celtics, which is this legendary team in the National Basketball Association from their creation from 1946. I need to ask you something which I hope isn't too much in the weeds for everybody here, but in preparing for this, I find out that the Boston Celtics lift their name from someone called the original Celtics, which is one of the barnstorming teams in the late teens, the early 20s, and really developed by a guy named James Fury. But I can't find out anything about James Fury. Is there an Irish story behind the original Celtics and this idea of touring the country with basketball?
So this is the New York Celtics. As it were, the originals. They exist from 1914 to 1930. They do have a brief stint in the American Basketball League, but as you say, they are very much in, the Harlem Globetrotters sort of ballpark, that they are a team that tours. The number of miles they travel every year in a pre-plane era is insane. Thousands upon thousands of miles, East Coast, West Coast, North, South, to play these exhibition games. The Fury link, does seem to be the one who identifies the phrase, the term, and the Irishness of this team. There's no evidence that they're recruiting Irish players, but they're there as an Irish identity. Again, I think it's largely to do with their location within New York. It's near the sort of major Irish districts. In 1946, when the Boston franchise comes on stream, their owner very much looks at this memory he has of these touring teams of the original Celtics and think this is brilliant. If we use that name, what is Boston? Boston is the Irish city. So for this, as it were, new professional sport, all these Irish people will think Celtics, brilliant, let's go. And he very much leans into this. He does have to buy the name off the owner of the original Celtics, has to pay him off. But the Boston Celtics emerged in 1946. It's there to appeal to that Irish population, and it becomes part of their shtick, if you like, that their logo, a bit like Notre Dame, is a leprechaun with a basketball. Each year, I think they only stopped it a few years ago, they had a tradition of producing a special uniform to play in and around St. Patrick's Day. So again, it's a team that, isn't full of Irish people or Irish American people, but it's a team that really combines the identity of Boston as the Irish city the Boston Celtics are the Irish American basketball team. I'm not sure it's as strong as Notre Dame, but it's definitely there as a representative of what Boston is as a city.
In listening to you talk about the sort of development of Irish sport and Irish in sport in America, I'm reminded in the earlier conversation we had in one of these episodes, Mike, with Ruth Barton talking about cinema. And Ruth was telling us if you go back to the 1910s, the 1920s, the Irish were likely figuring as gangsters and pretty edgy figures. By the time you get into the mid-20th century, you know, they're moving behind the camera, they're moving up, as it were, but they're also more positive figures. I suppose what I'm saying is that cinema seems to have been a kind of vehicle for assimilation. Do you think sport was as well?
I think it is in many ways because it's also multi-layered. Because I don't want to get too difficult about this. I think it's an assimilation for that idea that you have those Irish players as in baseball, those Irish boxers, these figureheads for the neighborhood. So you look at someone like Jack Dempsey in boxing, who very much kind of represents Boston. That, you know, he's a Boston strong boy who's world heavyweight champion 1882 to 1892. He's a visible presence walking around Boston. He's a star. He wins over 100 fights. In his career, he wins $1 million. He endorses products like Lipton beef. He appears on stage, playing himself, of course. But again, that assimilation that people are visible as athletes representing Irishness. But I think it's also important when you think about the way that modern sport evolves, what happened within the school system. Kids go to school in the 20th century, they're playing football, they're playing baseball, they're playing basketball. If you're Irish, you're a new kid on the block, just arrived, kid goes off, that's how they assimilate. They're suddenly playing with multiple ethnicities in this melting pot. The one thing they might have in common is they're all playing basketball. Mm-hmm. They're on the football team. Or they're leaning into it as spectators. Again, I think sometimes when we think about sport and identity, we look at the players and say, oh, here's an Irish American. But you think about the sheer numbers that are going to ballparks, football games, collegiate football, basketball. These run into the millions across a year. A large proportion of those people are going to be Irish and Irish American. So the idea that you're there communing with your neighbor while you watch your city team, it's an important part of a shared experience, which isn't necessarily an Irish experience, maybe an Irish-American player or something, but you're leaning into the idea, oh, we're from Philadelphia, we're from New York, we're from Chicago. You're creating that kind of vehicle for assimilation, which is through shared experience. That you may recruit, may at the end of it go back to your own neighborhood, you may go and sit in an Irish bar and talk to an Irish policeman, but at the moment of being in the stadium, you're there with 40,000 other Americans.
Yeah. So I suppose if we do come through to the present, I mean, are we at a late stage of assimilation now? I mean, that's a sociological question as much as anything else. But what does it mean for sport? I mean, is it really just the symbolism of Irishness that's left? And even if it is, that too can be very important and significant. But what's the present moment of the importance of Irishness in American sport?
I think now it's interesting in terms of what, or how do we identify, as it were, Irish athletes? Because most of them are now kind of long Irish heritage athletes. They're not Irish. I mean, something like Tom Brady, the legendary New England Patriots quarterback, who, you know, is multi-ethnic in his backgrounds, but he says, I'm very proud of my Irish heritage, that his great-grandfather arrived back whenever. So he identifies. So that idea that people do lean into this as part of their kind of ethnicity. I don't think it's as visible now. I think the cultural importance of the GAA, certainly since the 80s when Irish inward immigration for various reasons because of immigration laws sort of largely dried up, the GAA has worked very, very hard that you're not having, you know, 20,000 people arrive off the plane each year to refresh the GAA. Therefore, you've got to get second, third generation people playing. Mm-hmm. And I think there's a good link there with kind of the whole rise of Irish dancing since Riverdance, that Irish and non-Irish think, oh, that's a fun thing to do. It's amazing. It's cultural. It's Irish. And I think the GAA worked very hard to do that. It's not elite sport. It's not a pathway to being a professional, but it's a pathway to understanding Irishness. Yeah. I think the symbolism when you think of the World Cup this year, with the Scottish takeover of Boston, the joy of the kilt and all those kind of stories. again, I think if you think back to 1994, the story at that point was very much about the Irish in New York, where they played 2 games, famously beating Italy and so on and so forth, that the carnivalesque Irish with all their green arrived. So I think the idea that Irishness transfers into America from outside, traveling teams, touring teams, major events. I think now it's in sporting sense, it's kind of that high point of assimilation that athletes, unless they particularly self-identify and want to talk about it, unless you're in a Notre Dame college football or a Boston Celtics, you're not made to be Irish, if that makes sense. So I think it's a much more a story. I think the absence, as it were, of identifiable Irish athletes talks more generally to that kind of level of how the Irish have assimilated, gone out, and that kind of those kind of identiforming things are now much more of choice. I'm going to play GAA. My team are the New York Yankees, but I love playing Gaelic football on Sunday. So it's that kind of double-headedness, if you like.
We can do both of those things. Finally, before we leave this, another element, I suppose, that's very much of the moment is a greater sort of fluidity of movement. The US is now open for movement in a lot of ways, but through media it is, and sport functions that way too. Do you think that Ireland and the United States are sort of, engaging each other in sporting terms in new ways? I mean, a very concrete example, I suppose, would be something like the college football games in Dublin and so on. So there are some new things happening too, right?
The college football games have been going since 2014 now. Now a yearly fixture again. I think that's very important for inward tourism, obviously, money. But again, I think it's important for reuniting, as it were, those college teams that have an Irish link or an Irish heritage with home. I think the Pittsburgh Steelers, same kind of journey. The Rooney family are so linked to this island. I think your broader point, Liam's a very good one about kind of social media. That you kind of think in the last few years, Irish rugby have played a couple of games in the US, famously beating New Zealand a few years ago. That kind of blows up on social media, not only as a sporting moment, but again, that kind of Irish takeover, all the green jerseys in the stadium. Now, they're not all travellers from Ireland to the US. A lot of those people are going to be Irish heritage people who perhaps don't understand rugby, but hell, it's Ireland, we're going. I think the GAA, through its own digital channels, but also, again, social media, when hurling gets clipped up, Americans think it's crazy, but they love it. So the GAA played a couple of exhibition matches for hurling in Fenway in the last few years and filled the place. Again, yes, there's going to be an Irish-American contingent in the audience. There's also people going, this game's crazy, we've got to go and see it. So I think that way that Irish sports and an Irishness is very mobile in the social media moment is very important for kind of connecting the two things. I think also you look at even the sort of domination of a sport in England or coming out of England, like the English Premier League, which has captivated the US, is starting to turn it very much into a soccer nation. You have Irish players that people have become familiar with. But again, I was talking to some students the other week. What are they watching? They're watching all these kind of podcast things like The Overlap. Who's the big sort of cheery villain on that? Roy Keane. So you have a former player in a way that now younger people consume their sport by not necessarily watching sport, but watching people talking about sport. People like Roy Keane become an Irish, again, maybe a bit of a stereotype, but I think hugely important for linking Irish Americans, with the idea the Premier League is, as it were, next door to Ireland. There's a lot of Irish players, less than there used to be, but there's still Irish players there. So I think that story, it changes shape and it develops, but I think through new media, it's more visible.
So I got to ask this. We can cut it from the edit, so I got to ask this, right? Mike, how many people are going to know that one of the greatest sitcoms of all time, Ted Lasso, that Roy Kent is based on Roy Keane? I mean, the first time I saw Ted Lasso, I said, that's Roy Keane on screen. Do people make that identification that you know?
I've heard it said, but yeah, definitely, it's definitely that kind of Roy Keane persona of the kind of angry, focused, sort of emotionally stunted man. But I think again, I think that's a fascinating thing with Keane is how he has developed as a pundit, and certainly this kind of podcast-based scenario, as this cheery Irish chaffy. You know he'll break your legs if he needs to, but he will present as friendly. So again, maybe we're just back at sort of 19th century baseball stereotypes, but they're there.
There you go. Your next book, From King Kelly to Roy Keane, The Irish in America. There you go.
That's it. Good working title. I don't know if that'll end up in the outtakes, but it's really good. It has to go somewhere. We'll use Roy Keane and Mike Cronin. But Mike Cronin, thank you. Thank you for helping us to really understand the importance, significance, and actually the real melodrama of Irish, the sport, and the making of the United States. Thanks very much.
Friend, thank you.
Thank you, sir. That's all for this episode of Ireland and the Making of America.
Thanks to Mike Cronin for joining and sharing his insights on the Irish sporting experience in America.
You can follow this series on all your favorite podcast platforms: Apple, Spotify, YouTube. You can follow the Clinton Institute website, or you can track what we're doing on Facebook and YouTube. You can also follow Liam Kennedy and myself on Instagram, on YouTube, where on Scott Lucas Worldview, we also have the latest on Ireland, the United States, and the world.
And if you enjoyed this episode, subscribe, share, or leave a review.
We'll be back next week with another conversation on Ireland and the Making of America.
Until next time, this podcast was brought to you by the Clinton Institute at UCD and produced with thanks by Michelle May.